Hello, students, and welcome to Anthropology 1040, an introduction to cultural anthropology. I am Dr. Linda Watts, and I'll be your instructor this semester. So let's get started with this first lecture. I'll provide an overview of the course and an introduction to basic course concepts, and I'll introduce your first assignments that you'll be working on this week for Module 1. So let me start by talking a little bit about your syllabus and your assignments that are involved with that, especially for this first module. Now, I'm putting up here a fun slide that I think anthropologists, probably many anthropologists have this slide in their PowerPoints for the first lecture. This is a Far Side comic, of course, by Gary Larson. And notice, if you will, what's happening in the picture. What do you see here? You see a group of supposedly rather stereotyped, but still traditional indigenous peoples, in their hut. And coming up the hill are some rather opulent anthropologist types. And notice what they're doing. They're taking their TV and their VCR and they're running to hide them so that the anthropologists don't see that they're really living a very modern life, which the anthropologists maybe don't want to see. There's kind of a comment on that. It shows the kind of a relationship between anthropologists, what we'll call ethnographers as we move on today, and the people they study in their communities. Often there seems to be a cultural divide between the anthropologist and their quote unquote subjects. Actually, probably we're more alike than we're different, and yet the job of anthropologists is to try to help to represent people's, either from within their own culture or from another cultural setting, as closely as possible, really, to their own point of view, to the point of view of the people being represented. Okay, and more and more that involves a collaboration between the anthropologist and the people in the community. But we'll get to that at the end of our history lectures for Module 2. Anyway, I'm just going to keep this Far Side commercial up while I talk a little bit about the syllabus and the first assignments for you. Okay. The very first assignment is going to be self-introduction. Some of you have already may have already accomplished that. Put that in to the discussion 1 area in Canvas. Now, I'm just inviting you, as you'll see in the discussion prompt, to say a little bit of something about yourself. It could include something about your major or your background or your strong interests or occupation, and maybe something about where you're at in your studies and what your goals are, for this class particularly, or for your life, and how you might, why you're here, why you might find yourself in this particular class. Now, if it's only to fulfill a cultural diversity or global diversity requirement or a sustainability requirement, that's just fine, and this course should help you do that. All right, now with that discussion, as with all of the 4 discussions that you'll have this semester, you will first put your own submission in, so you'll give a little bit of, say something about yourself for your self-introduction, and then wait until some other students have piped in, have submitted their own introductions, and you'll be able to see those. And then I want you to respond to 2 other students. So each discussion is a 3-point assignment, 1 point for your introduction, for your submission, and 2 points for responding to 2 other students. I think for the first, this self-introduction, first discussion, I think you may see all of the student introductions, and you just need to respond to 2. After that, you'll be put into small discussion groups of 6 to 7 people per group, and you'll only be seeing the submissions from within your group. And one thing to take note of with that is, depending on how the discussions are scheduled with regard to the modules and assignments, sometimes you may submit your submission before any other students in your group have submitted theirs. So don't worry if you need to wait a few days even sometimes before the rest of the students in your group put their submissions in, and eventually you'll be able to answer two others, and then I'll be giving you the full 3 points. Meanwhile, with these discussions, for the first discussion, I will respond to each of you individually because I'm welcoming you into the course, and I may say something to you. But after that, my purpose with these discussion groups is mainly for you to discuss amongst yourselves. So I might make a global statement, a global content through an announcement, but I won't respond too much to your individual discussion points. I will read through them, and that might prompt me to say something more globally for the class. But mainly, I'll be kind of monitoring, and once you've got your three submissions in, then I will give you your 3 points. And actually, later in the course, I'll probably even pull out further than in the beginning to give you a chance more to just more interact with each other. I will be monitoring, I will be making a global comment, but otherwise, these discussions are really meant for you guys to have some semblance of interaction with one another, in this online asynchronous class. So that will be the first assignment. Another assignment in this first module will be to watch a 30-minute video, and that will be the first film. And with each of, we have 9 films in the course, and you're required to submit 7 film reports of those, not for watching 7 of those 9 films. And you'll see that in the syllabus laid out clearly. If you do all 8 or 9, you'll get extra credit points for the 8th or the 9th at the end of the semester. I recommend you do all the 9 reports because you do need to watch all 9 films. You don't want to just watch 7 films because all the films will be included on your quiz questions. So you need to have seen the film and to have done any reading associated with the module, any assignment that you've handed in for the module, plus watch all the video lectures for a module. Even, if there are more than one video lecture, watch them all before you take the quiz. There's 1 quiz for each module, 10 modules. Some of the modules are 2-week modules, so you'll get the quiz after 2 weeks in those cases. And usually those have 2 to 4 video lectures associated with those 2-week modules. So your first film report I will talk about at the end of the introduction. I'll give you to the course today so you can see how that first film is embedded within the topical content material of the class. Now, I would say from a very broad overview perspective, this class, Anthropology 1040, Introduction to Cultural Anthropology, is going to provide you with an understanding of the range as well as the basis of variation in social organization and in cultural beliefs and values around the world. In addition, so cultural diversity is the central theme of the class. In addition, this class, since it also does fulfill an environmental, ecological sustainability requirement, will also, from the beginning and all the way through the course, be helping you look at the relationship, the close relationship actually, between culture and ecology, between cultural beliefs, values, and practices, and ecological use of resources in an environment within a cultural setting, and also ecological sustainability. You're going to find, I hope, that you'll understand how cultural survival and ecological survival, or cultural sustainability and ecological sustainability, especially for indigenous peoples, third world peoples, go hand in glove. So we'll be talking about that as we go along, but please understand that from the beginning. I'll give you a quick example. The Lacandon, Lacandon, Maya, Maya, peoples of the Yucatan area, Mesoamerica. Many of you have heard about the Mayans, and they reached a peak of social development in an almost a city-like way of life. They were what we would call not a chiefdom, but you might say kind of almost a chiefdom way of life. and until about 900 AD, when they left their complex uh, uh, pueblo sorts of cities, and uh, they didn't, though, actually disappear. We know that at this point in their development, these very complex and concentrated kind of city towns almost were overusing resources in the areas and putting pressure on the resources to such a degree that at one point they simply had to break apart and revert, somewhat to earlier or more simple and less concentrated or complex living patterns. That will make sense when we look at subsistence in Module 2 and economics, in fact, in Module 3, and what is happening to the Maya. But what's interesting is they didn't just disappear. I mean, there are contemporary Mayan peoples, and what happened was they sort of dissipated into the surrounding areas and reverted to a horticultural way of life with some degree of sort of rotational cropping on terrace, not well, on raised fields, this kind of thing. And actually, some contemporary Maya peoples, the ones who are still most traditional, still live in that horticultural way of life. Now, that horticultural way of life is sustainable, right? It's a sustainable ecological practice, which has also allowed their traditional culture to be sustained through all these, centuries since. Now, of course, many have also moved into the cities and this sort of thing, and there's a different kind of adaptation involved for those modern Maya peoples. But the relationship between cultural sustainability uh, and ecological sustainability is very important. When Europeans came into that same Yucatan area, right? What did they do? They brought cattle. They bring in roads. They destroy the rainforest. And once land is used for cattle, it cannot be used to grow anything essentially ever again. Okay. So Europeans have gone into that same area and in a non-sustainable way, destroying the resources in the region, where you have these little pockets of contemporary Mayas still using a basic horticultural adaptation, who are, still surviving, sustaining the environment and their own way of life. One thing to keep in mind, and that's a kind of a precursor to some of the case examples we'll see throughout the course, is that as Western peoples, which probably all of you are, speaking English, living here in America, whatever your home of origin might be, as Western people, we tend to have this notion that progress, right, means change. Progress to a Western outlook or mindset tends to involve technological change, sometimes so rapid that our older generations can't keep up. Whereas traditional indigenous peoples often measure success not by progress or change, but by sustainability, by tradition. Tradition, right? Tradition, right? People like the Amish, even in our own society, that we'll be looking at, in our own country, that we'll be looking at, uh, view, and many indigenous peoples like the Kayapa, we'll see a good film about at the end of the course, like the Navajo that we'll see early on with your second module coming up, or your third module coming up, uh, think that they want to keep things pretty much as they have been through the generations. There's that Sioux Indian notion of 7 generations. You want to live in a sustainable way of life so that you look forward to 7 generations still being able to thrive and to maintain traditions. So tradition is what's important in most indigenous, non-industrialized societies, whereas change and progress is important here. Therefore, also Westerners tend to look at ecological resources like forests, etc., in the Yucatan, right, as expedient, as commodities, as there for our use and exhaustion, even, right? If the whole world, think about this from the very beginning of the course and, all the way through, if the whole world lived like we did, right, in our Western cultural, technological, industrialized way in cities and suburbs, etc., we would probably destroy all the resources of the planet rather quickly. It's actually those contemporary indigenous people still maintaining traditional ways of life, thank you, because they want to, that are actually helping to sustain the ecology on this planet as much as possible. Some anthropologists have speculated, in fact, that there's a guy named Marvin Harris. You'll hear about him a little bit, I think, in the history lecture. He has an approach called cultural materialism. Well, Marvin Harris, in a book called Our Kind, about humanity, speculates, as by the way, so did Stephen Hawking fairly recently before he passed away, that mankind may not survive the 21st century if we don't find a way to live in a more sustainable way with our environment. And as a cultural anthropologist, I can say, therefore, we stand to learn from traditional indigenous peoples who don't want our way of life. They don't see our way of life as progress for them. They want to maintain their traditions and contribute to the whole of what we'll call global society by the end of the course through their traditions and through their stewardship of the environment. How about that? All right, well, I think that's pretty much of a basic intro. Let's move on here. Let's begin to talk about the basic concepts of the course. You can read more on the syllabus about assignments and requirements, and I leave you to do that by printing out that PDF syllabus in the home or syllabus area. But I want to get this part out of the way and move on here. Anthropology is essentially a four-discipline or four-field field of study or discipline. And it's always been important that anthropology maintains sort of distinctions between these four different branches or sub-disciplines of anthropology, where anthropologists specialize. You know, if you were to go on into graduate school in anthropology, either for your master's degree or for your PhD, you would learn a little bit about all four of these sub-disciplines, but you would specialize. You would become a specialist in one of these four fields. And ergo, at UCCS in the anthropology department, you know, which is a very good, honestly, strong four-year anthropology program that is a good preparation for graduate studies in anthropology. You will see that we have courses in all four of these fields. So I just want today to look at what this class is looking at compared to other introductory level, 1,000 level courses in anthropology, essentially. So 1020, Anthropology 1020 deals with archaeology. And we have archaeologists in our department who are teaching a range of courses, in that field. Everything from prehistoric archaeology, which may go back even to Paleolithic times and the origins of humanity, the different kind of the evolution of the hominids and development of Homo sapiens, how all that's come about. And the physical aspect of that, they'll look at bones and cranial structure and teeth and hair and, the study of the physical peoples. That would be physical. Well, I'm sorry, that would be physical anthropology. I just shifted from archaeology. If you don't mind, I'll just clean this up. For archaeology, we can look back that far. We can look at prehistoric archaeology by looking at what we would call the ruins or the distant remains, of a people's, even before peoples had any written word, any literacy, right? And historic archaeology actually deals more with cultures that have had literacy, so that they have been able to write down aspects of their culture, or we see evidence of their culture in their written records. Okay, and you study these past cultures either through the written records, if you've got that, even with, say, the Aztecs, and their codex and whatnot. All right, hieroglyphs and whatever we can read going back to the earliest alphabets, to even earlier people where we need to reconstruct just on the basis of what we can see in their tools, their lithics, their stone tools, etc., how they lived and how they moved. And we infer from looking at the physical and the archaeological, the architectural, the buildings, etc., that people left behind, we can infer something about the cultural context of these people. So you'll see that archaeology is listed under a broad spectrum of cultural anthropology on this slide. All right, because we do look a little bit there, we try to anyway, inferring cultural values based on what we can see from these past cultures, material artifacts and remains. Now, 1010, Anthropology 1010, is the study of physical or biological anthropology, which I was beginning to merge into there. So let's look at that now itself. Physical anthropology is where you would look at the evolution of the hominid species, when and how it, from the earliest Australopithecines, to hominid development in different species like Homo habilis, and all the way up through the Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, and then archaic Homo sapiens, maybe around 75,000 or so years ago, or no, actually, archaic Homo sapiens would be like 45,000 years ago. Neanderthals about 75,000 years ago, and then gradually, say, more recent Homo sapiens from about 30,000 on or so. Very interesting study, and we have many classes in physical anthropology and biological anthropology that do look at things like I was saying of, teeth and crania and bone structures, because we can learn a lot about even diseases of early peoples through burials, and physical anthropology would be where you would be looking at all of that, sort of the forensic side, the physical forensic side. All right, and you can see here, anatomy, genetics, forensics, comparative primatology, how humans compare to actually rather closely related species. We're hominids. We have like 95 or 98% of the same DNA as chimpanzees, right, who are pongids, right, within the primate genera or species. Okay. So now that would be archaeology, physical anthropology, 1010, 1020, and we're not covering those in this class. This is not a four-field study. In this class, we are primarily focusing on what I've put as cultural anthropology here, proper in parentheses under the word ethnology, just to make the distinction between the higher order and the specific field of cultural anthropology. Ethnology, and a word I won't ask you to remember other than to see it here on the chart. Ethnology is a comparative study of cultures, okay, in terms of societies and cultural beliefs and values. All right. I'll look a little bit later today at what the distinction is between, say, a social structure and a culture, but we'll get to that. So cultural anthropology as a whole is the main focus of 1040, this class, all right, where we're looking at contemporary peoples. I tell people I'm an anthropologist, and they say, when did you do your last dig? Well, the only digging I do is digging into, people's understandings of their own way of life through their languages, through their practices and their beliefs and their values that they share. Okay. Contemporary peoples. These are peoples that either have their own written history or have been written about generally that we can study that way. This involves cultural adaptations, and adaptation is an important word. In archaeology, we might talk about evolution of human species, and that's a biological evolution that we're looking at there in physical anthropology and somewhat in archaeology, but mainly physical anthropology, again. But in cultural anthropology, we really don't use the word evolution. Instead, we would use the word adaptation, because cultures change in place within generation. The kinds of change or innovation that might come about, from generation to generation are very organic, you might say. They happen in response to things changing or happening around the people. They may need to adapt to changes in their environment or to other people moving in or to colonialism and things like this. So cultural change and development is a matter of adaptation. That's one of our key words we'll be looking at here today, too. Cultural anthropology, to the extent it looks at culture, is looking at beliefs and values. I like to say culture is what's in your head and in your heart, okay? It's not really something that can be measured or as a physical object. It's not. A culture is not a physical thing, It's an outlook. It's a perspective. It's a cognitive orientation to the world that we adapt to cognitively, that we develop, that we acquire cognitively within the first couple of years of life as we're learning a language. Now, that being said, and we'll come back to the rest of these points about cultural anthropology later, culture and language go hand in glove. You can't really separate one from the other. Now, in my specializations, I should give a little bit about myself, I suppose, am both a linguistic anthropologist as well as a cultural anthropologist. I have essentially a double PhD in those two fields, linguistic anthropology and cultural anthropology equally. And my studies then have often looked at the relationship between language, culture, and cognition, another area that I'm very interested in, and psychology. Okay, but linguistics. So linguistics is the scientific study of a language, right? Or of languages, of the comparative languages. And language is so closely connected with culture because while every people, as long as every human being, as long as they've grown up and been socialized within a social system, within a family or in a community, speaks a language, but languages vary tremendously from culture to culture, from people to people. And the differences in language language variation, are not just skin deep, like let's say in physical anthropology, you might say race is just skin deep, right? That's not true for language. Language is something deep. Language gives us categories through which to view the world. It's almost like a set of colored lenses that get thrown onto your face when you're born by the doctor or whatever. Like let's say you're born into a culture that has an amber look at the world, and you've got amber colored glasses, and if you've ever worn a pair of amber sunglasses, and you've worn it both inside and outside, let's say for a couple of hours, right? Then the whole world just appears normal. You don't see it as amber anymore. That's just normal. It's not until you take them off, that you see that the world is, not always amber tinted. Well, that's sort of what culture is. It's a set of filters that are cognitively embedded in our orientation to the world from early socialization and language. So those are some of the things we'll be looking at. So Anthropology 2800, which is an introduction to linguistic anthropology, the nature of language at UCCS, which I, by the way, also sometimes teach online, and which is available through Dr. Wood on campus at UCCS, along with other courses. ANTH 2800 is a key primary core course in anthropology because of this close relationship between culture and language. Okay, let's move on. Now I want to introduce for you 8 course concepts, which I'm calling key course concepts. I call these key course concepts, and I introduce them at the beginning of this class because these are concepts that you should be familiar with from the very beginning of the class today, and looking at the first film that you'll see today for this module, all the way through the course. Let's learn about it now so you can apply these concepts and learn more about them as we move through the course. So today, in this lecture, for the rest of this lecture today, I'm primarily going to flip back and forth between these two slides, these 7, or 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 course concepts, and 5 basic key course questions. These are questions that I want this course to answer for you. So by the end of the class and fairly early on, at least, all the way through the class, but probably especially through the second module even, you should have a clear understanding of these five questions. So today, let me talk a little bit about each of the core concepts and relate them to these five course questions. In fact, maybe it's better to do it that way first, looking at the course questions and how these course concepts fit in with these. So, first question, what is anthropology? Already we looked at that a little bit by looking at the scope of the branches of anthropology as a four-field discipline, right? Anthropology is, I like to say, the definition I like to give for anthropology as a whole will be the science of our humanity. The science of our humanity. And I say that because some people ask at the beginning, now, is cultural anthropology a science, a scientific approach? Or is it a humanistic approach? Is it a humanity field or a science field? And it's both. It's certainly both. Even just cultural anthropology itself has a scientific aspect to it because we're trying to not just study individual cultures, although that's important, and also usually the first step for gaining a broader viewpoint on cultures, but also a comparative, both regionally and globally, also comparing cultures and societies around the world. And you'll see that, especially when we look at starting with Module 3, looking at subsistence practices, economic systems, kinship systems, family, marriage, gender systems even, as we go up through those modules. You're going to see, which I think is through Module 5, right? You're going to see that anthropologists can tell you a whole lot about a people just by knowing some very basic facts, like what is their mode of subsistence? Are they hunter-gatherers? Are they horticulturists? Are they industrialists? If you tell me that a people are hunter-gatherers, even though I've never seen them or even heard about them, and let's say you've spent some time there, on a vacation or something and learned about a certain peoples and I've never heard of them, but you tell me they're hunter-gatherers, I can tell you a whole lot. I'm going to sound like I've got ESP. I can tell you that they live in small camp-like villages, not even really villages, but camps, and that most of the people in their traditional mode, and that most of the people they grow up with in their camps, they are related to by blood or by marriage. The textbook that I'm asking you to start reading already, The Forest People by Colin Turnbull, which you should have and be reading, right, and which I will be able to ask about, especially by Quiz 5, or Quiz 5, Module 5, is a very good introduction to one camp of Bambuti pygmies of the forest of the Congo area, written in the 1940s. Now, we still look at this. Really, this is one of the most common intro to anthro books in the world, right? Because it's one of the purest examples we have of what we will call, let me go back to the core concepts here, ethnography. Of an ethnography. The forest people is an example of an ethnography. Ethnography could be looked at in two ways. It's how we study a people ethnographically, and what we might write about a people in a book or an article or a film, like the 9 ethnographic films that you're going to see this semester. Ethnography, notice the word the root graph that could relate to writing, and ethno for folk or people, right? It's writing about a people or representing a people. And how do we do that? Like in the forest people, how does Colin Turnbull arrive at an ethnography? Well, first of all, he uses a method which is particular to cultural anthropology, somewhat used in sociology more and more as well, but particular to anthropology. It's the kind of the hallmark, of anthropology, cultural anthropology, called participant observation. This is a method. This is a method of field work, and what distinguishes cultural anthropology, let's say, from sociology often, is that an anthropologist will go to live and embed themselves within a community of people where they're trying to understand a people and their total way of life and write an ethnography about them, or they might come with some particular issue or topic that they're trying to understand, like something about the religion of this people or their language or kinship system or how they're adapting to the modern world, in their post-colonial environments, etc. So participant observation as a method, which is what Colin Turnbull uses in The Forest People to write his ethnography and to do his ethnographic study, right, involves exactly what the phrase, looks like: participation and observation. That is, it's important for the anthropologist to live in the community, not outside. We don't just go in and do surveys. We don't just go in and, give people questionnaires. We need to live in the community, usually for a year or more, to get an annual round of activities that are traditional for people in that community. We participate in everything we can participate in, not losing sight of the fact that we don't, quote, go native. That wouldn't be authentic and probably wouldn't be appreciated. We are coming usually. Now, we can do participation in our own culture too. We can do ethnography in our own culture, and therefore, we're participating very directly. But generally, we try to participate in everything we can participate in. If there's a wedding, we want to go to the wedding. If there's a funeral, we hope we might be invited to attend the funeral, and we try to be as innocuous and inobtrusive as possible. But while we're participating, we are observing. We're taking field notes, or we're interviewing people. That's part of participant observation, and then making reflections on the interviews as we go along, so we can generate more questions as we get to know people better and better over time. We learn their language. We speak their language as much as possible while we're there. I did my participant observation at Zuni Pueblo in New Mexico, and I studied the Zuni language for a couple of years before I went. I had a Zuni language tutor while I was there as well, and an interpreter. And anyway, we'll talk more probably about my study there. But Zuni is 35 miles, southwest of Gallup, 12 miles across from Arizona, and they live with a Kachina-based religion, Pueblo-style Native American culture still today, 2024, maintaining much of the religion, of their peoples going back, to like 1300s. Okay, we can talk more about that later. So you participate in everything you can participate in. I go to every Kiva dance or every Kachina dance I can go to, and then I ask people about it. You observe the dances, you observe whatever is going on, the ceremonies, and you try to understand them then. Now, here's where it gets a little more interesting. You are an outsider generally, or you're looking in your own culture, but you're still trying to understand it almost as an outsider would, right? From a more kind of objective point of view, although that's a misnomer. None of our work is really objective. It's what we would call intersubjective, right? Because I'm someone who has a subjective perspective. I can't divorce myself from my upbringing when I go to another culture. The best I can do is to distance, to detach myself as much as possible. That's why I want to live there for at least a year, embed myself as much as possible, learn the culture, the traditions, etc., as much as possible. But that doesn't mean that I've completely divested myself of my cultural baggage, let's say. So anthropology, we recognize, using, by the way, this last term here, reflexivity. If we're being honest with ourselves, we learn about ourselves as well as about the people we're studying when we embed ourselves like this in a culture other than our own. And this is called reflexivity when we reflect about our own biases, which, by the way, can help us to take, a more realistic view of a people. And we can separate, here's my bias, and then here's what they're telling me. I don't want to disrespect what they're telling me. In fact, the real focus for cultural anthropology is not to see how do we look at another people, but how do they present themselves? How do they understand the world? Now, participant observation then, using this ethnographic approach of wanting to try to understand a people really from an insider point of view, not just an outsider point of view, one thing it aims at is holism, Holism, let's make sure we understand this term. Holism, you can think of like with a W, W-H, holism, holism. I could add that to the slide if I wanted to. We're looking at a culture as a whole, not just in its parts. Even though when I went to Zuni Pueblo, my main focus was on their, what we call at this point, their kinship system, their kinship terminology, and how that relates to their social organization and their values and beliefs. Well, I was mainly interested in that linguistic aspect of their what I call relational terminology, how they address and refer to each other, and what that means to them. At the same time, I can't do that without taking into account certain religious aspects that might give me some understanding of that linguistic and cultural interface, their daily practices. I went and worked with a core family that I lived with and helped with their sheep. They would herd sheep, and I would help them to do that, and everything about their way of their economic system, then their interface with the modern world. Getting to know people in every aspect of their way of life, because a cultural perspective is not bound neatly, right? And the anthropologist then is trying to get this holistic view of how all these different aspects of culture, including modern influences, contemporary influences from outside the so-called culture, affect what's going on an everyday basis within the culture. So, cultural anthropology is holistic. It takes into account not just one topic about a people, but how all different aspects of a people and their total way of life fit together. You might say culture is like a gestalt, if you know that term, or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. You're looking at some of the parts, but you're most interested in how they're integrated into a greater whole that makes that culture unique and distinctive in and of itself, apart from any other culture in the world at that point in time. So it's holistic. And it involves the use of a certain perspective. I've been in anthropology for a long time. I may not look it. I hope I don't look it, but I'm 70, just turned 70, and I started, teaching this class when I was like 28 or something like that, through graduate school, and then 25 years at UCCS. Taught this course for a long time. And to me, I've always come back to this class. I've taught lots of different courses in anthropology through the years, some 17 different courses over the years. But this is the one I always come back to. This is I call it my mission class, Anthropology 1040, an introduction to cultural anthropology. This is bedrock to me. Because many of you will never take another anthropology course. I hope some of you will. Check out the minor, check out the major. It's a fascinating field, and you can do a lot with it if you choose to. But most of you, this may be the only anthropology class you ever take. And I take that seriously. My job is to help you understand and get grounded in the foundational perspective that cultural anthropology offers. This is a perspective on diversity, variation, prejudice, sustainability, and all these things together. So there's one key set of distinctions right here that I want you to understand. And by the way, this is going to be part of how anthropologists study culture and cultural systems. We'll come back to the other later. These two terms, ethnocentrism, I've got a slide later I can show you with a definition, and cultural relativism. These are the most important first two concepts, along with the concept of culture that we'll look at after this, for you to take to heart. And that's what the first film and my question, I have two questions for the first film for you to answer, answer both, will help you to ground as a concept. These two approaches ethnocentrism, cultural relativism, are two different perspectives that one might have looking at a culture, a society and cultural context other than your own. If you were dropped out of a helicopter in the middle of Timbuktu and you never learned anything about Timbuktu before, right? The first perspective you're likely to have, and I will say this one is actually a human universal at birth, or shortly after, as you learn the language in the first couple of years, would be ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is what allows us to adapt to our own culture. It is a perspective on what is appropriate, acceptable, or not within the lens of our own parents' and community's cultural outlook, their worldview of the world. Ethnocentrism, then, when you go to another culture, like Timbuktu, or when I first went to Zuni, if I didn't know much about them then, if I came with an ethnocentric point of view, this would mean I might come thinking that my way of looking at the world, which is what I've been introduced to from as a child, is the right way of looking at the world. It's all I have to go on. It's the only pair of glasses I've had. Let me go down a few slides to find a definition here for you. You see all their definitions for all these in the PowerPoints. I do want you to look at, the still PowerPoints, which are these same PowerPoint slides, but at the bottom of each module you have these in still form, and you can print those out and use them to study from, as I've said before. Anyway, ethnocentrism. The tendency to view one's own culture as best, kind of a superior attitude with respect to cultures other than your own, or even subcultures other than your own, or even any peoples other than your own. The tendency to view one's own culture and its peoples as best, and to judge the behavior and beliefs of culturally different people than you by your own, it says here, one's own or your own standards. I look out at the world through the centric viewpoint of my own upbringing, and the world looks to me like people are either like me or they're different from me. And if they're different from me, they're not as good. That's ethnocentrism. That's the basic ethnocentric point of view. Now, when I say that Anthropology 104 was kind of a mission course for me, my mission in this course, as I understand it, is to help you first to understand your own ethnocentrism. That's part of reflexivity. But then to try to move beyond it. As far as you can get in this semester, this whole class is basically about helping to move you from a more ethnocentric point of view, which is natural to your original upbringing, to a more cultural relativistic point of view, because you get exposed to variation and difference in social and cultural systems and outlooks on the world, and try to understand them not from your outsider point of view. Ethnocentrism is associated with an outsider point of view. I'm an outsider, and I come in with my values, and then I look at what's going on here, and I compare it to my own. Is it as good or not as my own? Mine's the best. That's ethnocentrism. Opposite view is cultural relativism. Cultural relativism, I'll give you this definition here from a guy named Roger Keesing, the position that the values and standards of cultures differ. The values and standards of cultures differ and deserve respect. Now, in particular, this is mine, the kind of cultural relativism I'm trying to help you understand and use and apply in this class, especially to the films and readings you'll be coming across later, that are going to tempt you into ethnocentric perspectives, but that I'm going to ask you to move away from and use this cultural relative perspective instead. The kind of cultural relativism I want you to understand is what I'll call methodological cultural relativism. Some people think of cultural relativism like the Star Trek prime directive. You don't change a culture, period. You don't do anything that might cause a culture to change. Okay, and there's this Also, there's kind of a moral cultural relativism, which some people call nihilistic, Nihil, nihilistic, right? Like no grounded values. This moralistic cultural relativism might say whatever people do wherever they are is fine because they do it, and we have no right to judge or or want them to do anything differently than they do. Now, the point of view I'm giving you here is not that, either one of those. When we look at something like child marriage in India, which we will, and dowry death in India, which has been on the increase since the 80s, not the decrease. What we need to do is not judge, but understand. Not judge with that knee-jerk reaction of this is wrong or whatever, because it's not what we do, but understand. Cultural relativism as a methodological tool says, get to know people from their own point of view. You've got to interview people and ask them about how they see the world, their own values, their own beliefs, their own cultural system, and how they understand it. Not how we would understand it from the outside, but from the insider point of view. That's the measure of how good our ethnography is how much can we represent that insider point of view correctly enough that an insider or member of that culture might say, yes, that is how we see the world. You're not misinterpreting me. So here, look at this. Methodological cultural relativism says to understand another culture fully, or more fully, anthropologists try to understand its members' own beliefs and motivations. Not just what do they do, but why do they do it in their own words, from their own perspective. And why is that important? Okay, think about, let's say we were time travelers and we went back to World War II, the Third Reich, and we're looking at the rise of Hitlerism, the rise of Hitler in the Third Reich, right? There's nothing in my bones that's ever going to condone, or positively value Nazism or the Holocaust. I'm sorry, but from my point of view, that was just wrong. It violated basic human rights. But it's not my job as an anthropologist to bring that ethnocentric, viewpoint to my study. What I want to do, if I want to study the Third Reich in Germany at that time, historically, or, if I were there, would be to understand from the point of view of members of that culture at that time why they thought the way they did, how they came to follow Hitler and go along with what he was, imposing upon them and the world. If I can understand from their own point of view, even from his point of view, heaven forbid, how these ideas came about, how they were implemented, how people went along with them, and what were the consequences and the results, that would be a methodological cultural relativism approach. Let's say, if I understood that, let's say, about the rise of Nazism with World War II, and then I saw something else in another part of the world where a similar kind of autocratic, despot was rising to power, let's say, if I might see some of the same things that were going on in Germany going on in this other society over here in the modern context. And that might help me to understand, the forces that are at work and, potentially even to make recommendations or policy, recommendations if the people in that society were interested in it, that might help them to avoid some of the more deleterious, terrible, awful consequences of genocide, etc. And there are cultural anthropology organizations around the world in South America, Central America, and various places in the world, even here, that are doing exactly that. Through their cultural relativistic lens, they're trying to understand like hotspots in the world. and how to help people prevent their own decline. Let's go back up here. So we've looked at these key course concepts. Every one of them we've covered. Now let's go back, make sure we're covering these questions. And the one that we really haven't specifically, I'll kind of back up and looking at some of the other ones here that we won't look at so much today, and then come back to number 2, the most important one. What is culture? So let's look at 3. We've looked at anthropology. What is anthropology? I say the science of our humanity. We look both from the outsider and the insider point of view. Why study cultures and social systems, and what can we learn? Well, I guess I was just looking at that a little bit, right? If we can understand how societies of various forms and cultures of various forms have come about in the world, this gives us a global cross-cultural understanding. It might help us understand processes of cultural and social development and change. What happens after colonialism and things like this. What are the tendencies? Where are people going? What issues are they facing? There's an awful lot that we can learn. And like we could study the Lacandon Indians of the Maya, and we can learn how to live a sustainable way of life in the Yucatan, right? We can learn not just studying down, we'll come back to this at the end of the semester, it's not just what do other people not have that we have, but what are the positive adaptations peoples have made that we can learn from if we were to adapt their ways. So there's a lot that we can learn. How? We have covered that through participant observation and the cultural relativist point of view and this holistic outlook, and also reflexivity to help separate our own biases from what we're trying to understand. And I think this last question, what has cultural anthropology contributed to our scientific and humanistic understanding? Well, the whole content of the course will help you to answer that question if I haven't answered a little bit now. But let's go back to the main thing here. What is culture? And I've got some definitions here. Well, cultural anthropology, so that's the central concept, for this whole subdiscipline of anthropology, is the concept of culture. And you'll often hear me avoiding using the word culture nowadays. I might say cultural context. You've heard me say that a few times today, like turning culture into an adjective, not a noun. That's because we now know, especially with our more kind of postmodern approach to anthropology that we'll look at a little bit with the history coming up. We now know that culture is not bounded. It's not neat. There aren't neat boundaries around a culture. There never have been. There never will be. Cultures are shot through with influences, historical and regional and political and economic influences. So the most we can say is there are cultural values. There are culture, but not everyone within a cultural group necessarily hold the same values at the same time. Different generations may hold slightly different outlooks, right? Because they've had different experiences. But still, let's go back to this original definition of culture. This goes way back to 1871, Edward Tylor. You'll hear about him in Module 2. His view in this, one of the very first book on cultural anthropology. Culture is that complex whole, notice the word whole, like holistic, which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired, I'll say, by humans as members of society. Culture is not instinctive. We're not born into a culture. I mean, when we're born into life, and culture is that set of colored lenses or whatever that's slapped onto our face, and then that continues with socialization and learning a language, right? It's an adaptive system. We adapt cognitively to the world we live in through early child rearing, that socialization, and language learning. Okay? So culture is something that has to be socially learned or acquired and transmitted. We transmit culture through, raising children, socialization, as primary socialization, rewarding and punishing for acceptable and not acceptable, behaviors. And what is acceptable or normative or conventional or not within a culture and a society, of course, change over time as that society changes. Sometimes older generations or people in a rural part of the country may have different values and attitudes than people in an urban or suburban, context nowadays here in America. And so the American culture is very broad and diverse. We'll look at that near the end of the semester. But wherever you grow up, in your family and your community, and then in your broader community or region, right, or nation within the world, right, uh, you acquire certain values as you acquire this kind of ethnocentric initial view of the world, so that you can get by in the world with those values. And then, you expand that as you go through life. Maybe you take an introduction to anthropology course where you get introduced to cultures all around the world, and your outlook on the world expands. I hope so. Culture. But here's another definition, a more recent one of my favorite ones, from one of my favorite anthropologists. He was my hero when I was in graduate school, from 1979 to 1992 at Arizona State University. Thank you very much. Is when I studied cultural and linguistic anthropology for my PhD. And Geertz was on the rise through the 80s. Clifford Geertz, University of Chicago. He's passed away since then. But one of his wonderful books, I encourage, if any of you are anthropology majors or wannabes, get Clifford Geertz's The Interpretation of Cultures, which is an anthology of some of his articles, to really understand how we can do anthropology in a more modern perspective, to a certain degree, and we'll come back to him a little bit later in our history lecture. But I like his view of culture. As a matter of fact, it comes from an article in The Interpretation of Cultures about religion, not culture, about religion as a cultural system. I think that's what it's called, religion as a cultural system. So here's his definition of religion. But you can replace the word culture, which is I've done here on this slide. A religion is, a culture is, think of this connection, the picture a people have, got it, of the way things in sheer actuality are. The picture people have of the way things are. It is their most comprehensive, total, holistic ideas of order. Their most comprehensive ideas of order. In other words, we impose order on the world through language and culture. And this is the world that we live in, that we inhabit, ethnocentrically or from a more broad perspective when we get exposed to more. And I think there's another slide with this. Maybe not. I should have another of his, what he adds to this. He adds to this in that same article. So culture is the picture people have of the ways things are. So it's like we look at the world through amber-colored glasses, so the world is amber. That's what's natural to us. But it's not natural to someone in pink glasses. That's natural to them. The culture is that filter between us and the world, which is magnified and expressed and cognitively embedded in cognition through language and also social routines and rituals, this kind of thing. He would also say then that culture is a combination of two things. And I don't seem to have the ability to write on the slides here, so I'm going to go back to the earlier overview slide here. What is culture? And you might want to write, if you've printed out your PDF version, I mean your still PowerPoint slides of these slides under culture. So you have his definition, culture is the way things are. And what that means for him is that culture is a combination of two concepts, of two things, which are worldview, W-O-R-L-D, W-O-R-L-D, view, V-I-E-W, worldview, plus, this is a formula for what is culture, worldview plus ethos, E-T-H-O-S, according to Clifford Geertz. So, worldview is that picture you have of the world. It is how the world appears to you through your colored lenses. through your cultural beliefs and values, norms, what's considered, conforming or deviant, and all those things are part of your culture, are part of your worldview. What is considered normal? My culture, ethnocentric. Okay? So your worldview, the way you see the world through your cultural and linguistic lenses, plus ethos, E-T-H-O-S, means how we ought. I think of it as the oughts, O-U-G-H-T, the shoulds, the oughts. How ought we, how should we behave and interact and even understand ourselves and each other by virtue of the worldview of our culture? So not just what are the normative beliefs and values and practices, but how do those normative beliefs and values and practices influence us to understand what is right and what is not right, what are proper ethics, behavioral norms, the ethos of a people. Okay? Okay. So that answers these 5 course questions. And here are these definitions. There are more definitions you can look at. And these are all, ideas that might show up on your first quiz. So you might want to look through these definitions as you go through it. And now let me just introduce to you your first film assignment. And I'm going to ask you to apply 2 of the concepts, the key concepts that we've talked about here. The film, and you'll see it right in the module, you stream it right from the module. You don't have to go to the library to get it or pay for it or anything like that. It's in your module. Just click on the film, little film icon, and the film will come up for you. It might ask you for your student identification number. I don't think it does, but it might. Then just do what it says to do. By the way, when you're watching the films in this class, usually I would ask you to use Google Chrome or Firefox, not Safari. You may not get the film from Safari. And you should be on usually at least, a laptop or a desktop. You may not be able to access the film on your phone. Maybe on your iPad, but maybe not. If you run into any trouble accessing the films, get in touch with the Faculty Resource Center, FRC at uccs.edu, FRC. I think it's in your syllabus how to contact them. And they'll fix it in a moment for you, don't worry. Anyway, so this first 29-minute film called Not Without My Veil I'm introducing it to you because I want you to have an example, more or less, with the first film you see in this class of relative, depending on your background and your origins, relative, quote, culture shock. Culture shock. That's, what's it like to land in a culture you've never been in before, or that you have a lot of ethnocentric ideas about because you've never had any real contact with people. Culture shock. This is a film, I think the anthropologist is a Norwegian woman who is a good participant observer. She goes to the Middle Eastern Society of Oman, O-M-A-N, and interviews Omani women about their way of life, how they feel particularly about whether they wear the veil or not, or whether they need to, and what it means to them. Again, she's trying to get an insider point of view to arrive at a culturally relativistic understanding of these people. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do with this film is a little bit like an object lesson. I've got 2 different questions that operate on 2 totally opposite points of view. First, I want you to watch the film, Not Without My Veil, and you might even take notes on this first perspective. From an ethnocentric viewpoint, from the point of view of your own cultural baggage, what do you think about the veiling of women in Middle Eastern societies like Oman? And from this perspective, what do you make of the title of the film? So, this is Please hear me now. Remember I said this is a mission course for me to move from ethnocentrism into cultural relativism. We're going to do it right now. This is the only time in the class that I'm going to ask for or accept from you an ethnocentric response. I want you to show me that you understand the concept of ethnocentrism by first responding to this film from your own ethnocentric, usually Western, depending on where you were born, perspective. And if you were born, by the way, in the Middle East, well, you'll have a different take on this question, which is good. So first, from an ethnocentric point of view, what do you take away from this film? Answering this question. And then I want you to put your response, your ethnocentric response, away. I never want you to use that point of view ever again on any of the other film reports or reading reports or discussions in this class. In fact, I'm going to be taking points away from you after this first assignment. Anytime you come at the question with an ethnocentric outsider, primarily outsider point of view. But for now, I want you to use it on the first response to this film. And then put it away, walk away, go get a cup of coffee or something, come back. Maybe watch the film again, or maybe just reflect on it again and answer the second question. From the point of view of cultural relativism, now, what role might the veil have for successful Omani women? How do modern Omani women regard wearing the veil, and why? So this asks you to look at this question from the point of view of the Omani women who are interviewed by the anthropologist in this film. And the whole film is her interviewing these women. So you need to turn this whole thing on its head. Now look at it not from the outsider point of view, but from the insider point of view. And to get your full 10 or 20 points, is it, I think, for a film report? No, 10 points for a film report. To get your full 10 points, the kind of 5 points for each question here, you've got to show me that you understand ethnocentrism, show me that you understand cultural relativism, and honestly what I look for is a shift, a big shift in those two perspectives. Okay. Good enough for this first lecture. I don't know how long it's been, but it's probably been over an hour. This is your first lecture for Module 1, and I hope that you enjoy the course. And I'm trying to learn how to turn this thing off. I hope I haven't lost it completely here. Stop. Bye-bye.